I think my interest in mechanical items has always, been there since I was young, and I was always trying to chop things up and, build models, take things to bits, and I was just always intrigued with how things worked. My father was at the time, he was sort of interested in antiques, and he had an interest in clocks. And I became interested at that point. These mechanical devices, large mechanical devices, was of interest to me. And I was coming up to the point of leaving school. I knew that I didn't want to continue with education. I was 16 years old at the time. And my father found this horology course in Manchester. And I went and enrolled on the course. And that was a big turning point for me, I remember the first day at college, and that was the best day of education I'd ever had. Yeah, I knew that really horology was going to be my life from that moment on. So I first met George Daniels while I was at the college in Manchester. And I think it was in the second year that we heard that this man called George Daniels was going to visit the college. I didn't know who he was, but somebody said that he made watches by hand. And I didn't really believe that that was possible, because for me as a watch repairer at the time, everything was made in industry. I suppose I was a bit sceptical about this person, George Daniels, who could apparently do this. But anyway, the next day he arrived and all my sort of preconceptions were just blown out of the water, and in came this sort of incredible man who had real authority, real presence. He had a watch. He had this pocket watch called a Space Traveller, and I asked to have a look at it. And out this watch came, and it's just the most incredible watch you've ever seen in your life. And it's at that point that I sort of realised that I'd witnessed greatness, and that I wanted a bit of that. I wanted to. I suppose I was asking myself, could I go down this route, this path of George Daniels, and try and make my own watches? And that was the starting point. That was the real beginning of all this huge journey that I've been on. After college, I went to work for a company in Manchester doing trade repairs. It was a service centre for a large watch brand. And I enjoyed it. It was interesting work for a time, but this meeting with George Daniels kept coming back. And I sort of thought that, really, do I want to be repairing watches for the rest of my life? I thought there's something more interesting, and this idea of being able to make something from scratch, this building of a watch, interested me. And in the end, I decided to write to George Daniels to ask if he would apprentice me. Got a very nice letter back saying, no, he didn't think he's in a position to apprentice people because he always worked on his own. But would I like to come over here to the Isle of Man to meet with him and to discuss my aspirations for, watchmaking. So I came over. I think I was 19 years old at the time, and he took me to his workshop and showed me around, this equipment here in this room. And basically, at the end of the day, he talked about his work. He talked about how he got into watches, and I was asking him questions about how to make watches, and he said, I can't teach you. He said, you've got to go away and you've got to teach yourself. He said, if you're driven, you'll do it. But he said, if you're not really interested, then you're wasting your own time. But also, he said, you're wasting my time. So I'm not going to sit down and teach you how to make a watch. But I went away and I said to my father, well, I want to make a watch. So, fortunately, he was in a position where he was able to loan me some money to buy a lathe and get me going, and, with a small workshop at the house. And I was incredibly naive. I really didn't understand the enormity of the task of making a watch by hand. I seriously thought it would take about a year or 18 months to make the first watch, and that I thought I would be a recognised watchmaker. I was so deluded. I suppose what I had to learn over that period was the basic skills. I was working sort of, 12, 15 hours a day, sort of 6 days a week-ish, sometimes 7 days a week. Eventually, over the course of 18 months, the first watch was completed. So I contacted George Daniels again and said that I made a watch, and can I come and show it to him and, hopefully get some advice on it. and he asked to look at the watch, and very quickly I could just tell that he wasn't impressed with it at all. He's really quite cheesed off with that. And he looked at the watch and he said, well, look, it's handmade, it looks handmade. And he said, what you must remember is that a watch which is made by hand shouldn't look as if it's been made by hand. It should look as if it's been created. And you shouldn't see the hand of the maker in the watch, because you are competing with all these brands, all these big companies out there who are making everything on machines. Well, look, he said, you made a watch that works. That is the biggest challenge. So go away, put that watch to the back of the bench and start another watch. And that's what I did. So then I went home, and this time I wanted to build a watch which was more complicated, because I thought the more complicated it's going to be, the more experience I'll gain from it. And so I started this watch. It was a tourbillon pocket watch with a 4-year perpetual calendar mechanism on it, and it had a detent escapement and so on. And I started the building of it, and I was starting to look more at the design of the watch and think a bit, how am I going to make this look like one of my watches? But the other big challenge was making parts. It was always making parts. It was having the discipline to spend the time to perfect each component. And I started building this first watch. And I think within about a year, the watch was working. It's all together and is a lot better than the previous watch I made. So again, I decided to contact George and arranged to meet to show him this watch. Anyway, eventually a meeting was made, and I turned up at the house at the time, and he opened the door, and he sort of grumbled. He had a very gruff voice, and he said, "Oh, you better come in," and he could barely look at me in the face. And he said, "That first watch that you brought me," he said, "what on earth were you doing bringing me that watch?" He said it was appalling. Anyway, we got into the workshop. He said, "Well, we better look at this watch." And obviously, the stakes were now very, very high. And he started looking at this watch with his eyeglass, turning it around in his hands. And he said, "Where did you get the case from?" So I said, "I made the case." And then he asked if he could open the back, and he did. And he looked inside, and he said, "Who made the tourbillon carriage for you?" So I said, "I did." And then he said, "Where did you get your escape wheel from?" So I said, "I did." "What about the detent? Where was that from?" So I said, "Well, I made the detent." And he then just stood up, closed the back of the watch, and big smile on his face, and said, "Congratulations, you're a watchmaker." And it was the most incredible moment of my life. It was sort of 7 years of work, which was finally come to an apparent end. And it is an amazing experience, incredible. And he used to say this a lot: you've got to make a difference. There's no point in going into that workshop and making a watch unless it makes a difference to horology. You can give up. He said everything else is a waste of time, and there's no point in just making pretty watches. I had ideas to build my very first sort of completely in-house watch, so the Series 2. And I had this idea to make more than one watch a year. And how was I going to do that? And how do you take an idea into production and build watches? So that was massive. That was and again, I was back into working sort of 6-7 days a week. Didn't take holidays, didn't earn any money. And that went on for 10 years. And the business just about scraped through every single year. We were teetering on whether we would be able to survive. If I just kept focusing on the quality and kept focusing on what I wanted to achieve, then eventually I hoped that everything else would come right. And it did. There was a big turning point in 2011 when suddenly I felt this tipping edge. We'd gone over this sort of tipping edge, and suddenly, for the first time in 10 years, we were in control of the business. I built the first coaxial watch in 2006, and then I sort of tweaked and changed it over the following few years. And it's in 2010 that I came up with the idea for the single wheel coaxial escapement. And that was a significant step forward in the development of the escapement. And that really started, this journey of continuous improvement, really. And even today, we're now onto our Mark II version of the escapement. And later this year, we're going to be announcing the results of all that work over the years. In this world which is very high tech, I think people are looking for some reality, and this idea of designing and physically making watches is an incredible thing to be able to do. So in order to survive as a watchmaker, the traits that you really need, you need to be self-critical. That is a big part of it. You need to be able to stand back and look at the work that you've just done and to be able to say, can I improve on that? And if you can't, then you're finished from day one, really. And that's something that I had to learn very, very quickly. People who are wanting to spend a lot of money on a watch, they are super critical, and they are looking for perfection. And if you do not reach that level of perfection, then you are finished. Well, watchmaking is an interesting sort of discipline, really. It's you're creating tiny machines. You're making machines which tell time. They're made up of hundreds of components that you had to obsess over, and to try and get them, the watch built up and so on. There's a lot of art in designing and building a watch. There's a lot of me in those watches, obviously. They are my watches, and that's pushed on by the artistic side of it, the technical side of it, and trying to make an improvements to the mechanical timekeeper. It's a continuous sort of journey, really. It's never left me.